Um, Good. Welcome to another episode of Environmental Fridays. This is, of course, a continuation from last semester. This semester, we will begin with a guest speaker that's more local, I think, than many of our other speakers, Erin Fuller. She is she works with Van Buren Conservation District, and her presentation today will be about agriculture, effects of agriculture on water quality. More specifically, she is the watershed coordinator for Van Buren Conservation District in Pawpaw, which is not, Pawpaw is not too far from here, is it? I don't think.
Nope, probably about an hour.
An hour away? Yes, yes. So she's local. She has a bachelor's in biology from Skidmore College and a master's in geography from Western Michigan University. Do you guys learn geography in high school? Oh, wow. Yeah, that's what I'm finding out. That's incredible. When I was in high school, we learned geography. In fact, I went to school, of course, high school in the Caribbean, and I was learning geography about the United States and Canada and North America and stuff. It's incredible. Anyway, so it's a pleasure to have Erin here, Miss Fuller here with us today. And we look forward to her presentation, Agriculture and Water Quality. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Professor Murray, and all your students. I hate not being able to see people when I'm doing these presentations. So I'm used to like asking questions and seeing if people are listening or if they're asleep. So I will try not to put you all to sleep. But thanks so much for having me, and I'm excited to share with you this topic of agriculture and water quality. I think it's one that a lot of people who are interested in the environment kind of forget about, or it doesn't necessarily occupy a lot of our minds. We'd rather think about trees and butterflies and things like that. So I want to share with you some of the reasons that I got interested in this topic, and some of the things that are happening currently in our region, to just give you some ideas um, of of the interaction between that agriculture and water quality in our environment. So yes, I work in Pawpaw, Michigan. Well, in normal times, that's where I work. Right now, I'm working from home, which is in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I've been here for about 10 months now, but usually I work in Pawpaw, which is not too far away from you folks. So I think our regions are pretty similar. I want to tell you first just a little bit about conservation districts, because I started working for the Van Buren Conservation District 18 years ago, which is shocking. I'm not that old. It's not possible. But I just want to share with you a little bit about what a conservation district is, because I think a lot of people have not heard of them. What we are, we're basically a unit of state government. There's a conservation district office in almost every county in the entire United States. And what we do is we try to work with landowners to provide them assistance and information and education about different kinds of natural resource issues. So, for example, we might work with private landowners to save wetlands or put in conservation practices on their farm. We might help communities do tree plantings. A big thing we do every year is sell small tree seedlings so we can reforest areas. We do a lot of education. So like what I'm doing today and talking to you folks is part of that process. Um, so kind of anywhere you are across the United States, you can find a conservation district. And I want to talk a little bit about how we got started too, and it will kind of link to our topic today of agriculture. I'm sure you have all heard about the Dust Bowl. And that's when conservation districts got started. And just a little refresher, it was a period, about a decade, starting in 1929, 1930, where there were a combination of factors, the two biggest factors being a really severe drought, and that combined with poor farming practices led to this period where the soils, the farming soils in sort of the central part of the United States, Oklahoma and Nebraska, that kind of what we think of as major farming territory now, they were starting to farm it back in the 1930s. It had been wild grassland, but then settlers decided to start trying to farm that area. They didn't necessarily have good practices. They didn't necessarily know what they were doing. The crops they might have been trying to plant were not appropriate for that area necessarily. But that on top of a major drought really, really destroyed their soils. And the soils got very dry. That led to a lot of wind erosion. And it turns out that the top few inches of soil are super, super important for growing anything. And once you kind of ruin those top few inches, you're out of luck when it comes to growing crops. So that wind erosion blew the soil away. You can see in the photograph here, just piles of soil that has gotten blown over what these folks were trying to grow. So they lost their topsoil. They couldn't grow any things as well. They had major crop failures, and that of course led to economic devastation. So around that time is when Soil Conservation Service got started, realizing that work needed to be done to show people appropriate farming practices so they could keep their livelihoods and we could continue to grow food. But it took a while. You know, it wasn't an overnight process like most things. But anyway, that's just a little quick history lesson tying into how conservation districts got started. And one of the early realizations we in this country had of how our activities can have an effect on our environment and our ability to grow products, grow food. I also want to give you just a quick rundown on a watershed, because a lot of the work I do, we are looking at a watershed, and I'm hoping that by now education has caught up and is starting to teach the concept of a watershed in high school, or even earlier. I think my son learned about them in 3rd grade. So I hope you folks have at least heard this word. But the idea is that everything that happens in a land area ends up affecting a water body. So wherever you are sitting in a watershed, and you can sort of think of it like a bowl. So if a raindrop falls on the edge of my bowl, or a drop of water falls at the edge of my bowl, it's going to gradually flow into the middle of that bowl. And you can think of land area like that too. I'm sitting in the Kalamazoo River watershed right now, which is next to the St. Joe River watershed, which I think you folks are either in the St. Joe River watershed or the Glean River watershed, where you are probably. But yeah, it's all of that land area that all drains water to a common point of a river or a lake. And I do have a little video. Let's see if we can get this to work. That just illustrates the concept a little bit. My computer is running quite slow today, so my apologies, but it is thinking about playing a video. Oh, it's playing in the wrong tab. Let me switch this over.
So my wife.
This is not it. Oh, maybe. Oh, yes. This is just the ad. Okay. You guys get to watch an ad first. My apologies.
Got me this weird new tool for Christmas. And at first, I thought it looked kind of crazy. I didn't really understand.
What is a watershed? Is it a shed that holds water? Nah, try again. A watershed is all of the land that drains into the same location or body of water. People tend to think only of water bodies such as rivers, lakes, and wetlands as being part of their watershed. However, any land, whether it is park, farm, forest, school parking lot, and even the soil we build our homes on is also included. Think of a watershed as a funnel, collecting all the water within a specific area and draining into the nearest body of water. Drop by drop, water is channeled into soil, groundwater, creeks and streams, making its way to larger rivers and eventually the ocean. Everyone in the world lives in a watershed. Watersheds know no political borders, whether local, national, or international. Our environment, our economy, and our society all depend on a healthy watershed.
All right. So hopefully that gave you just a little visual representation of what I mean when I'm talking about a watershed. But I wanted to make sure that everybody kind of understood that concept because it really relates to the work that I do with agriculture, because I'm thinking about the health of the particular watershed that I'm in and trying to find all of the farmers in a particular watershed. If there's, if we have a particular concern about pollution in a specific watershed, then we have just sort of a small geographic area that we can go and try to work with everybody in that watershed to put in conservation practices and end up having a positive impact on their water quality. And I want to talk just briefly about different kinds of pollution. In the work that I do, we kind of divide pollution up into two different categories. I think a lot of people think about the one on the left, if you can see this, the photo with sort of pipes dumping out into a river. That's called point source pollution because you can pinpoint it. You can see, oh, there's a pipe, it's dumping pollution into the river. And it's pretty easy to fix because you just, if it's a factory that's doing the pollution, you go to the factory and you tell them they do conservation practices on that one spot, that one point, and you can fix it. And there's quite a few regulations actually. The Environmental Protection Agency and our state Department of Environment, they changed their name. It used to be the Department of Environmental Quality, and now it's the Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, or EGLE. But they regulate point source pollution pretty heavily. And so over the years, starting in about the 1970s, point source pollution has become less of a concern because there are regulations around it. The type of pollution I work on, though, is non-point source pollution. And this you can think of as sort of polluted runoff that might come from all kinds of different sources. And so you see in this picture here, it can come from like manure waste, where in an animal feedlot, or runoff from cropland, or poor management practices in forestry. If you cut down a whole bunch of trees all in one spot and you have bare soil, you get erosion, and that kind of runoff is a type of non-point source pollution. Rural homes, you can have issues like leaking septic systems that can pollute our water. City streets, cars driving on streets might drip motor oil on the street, and then it rains and that motor oil washes into a storm drain, and that ends up affecting the local waterways. And suburban development, same thing as some of the other areas. You can have bare soil that causes erosion that washes into a common waterway. So that's, again, it's just sort of background information. The sort of work I do doesn't focus on this point source pollution. It focuses on this like sort of broader, bigger picture, much harder to deal with. You have to talk to a whole lot of different people and get them all on board to try to solve issues. But I also want, before we get too deep into the weeds, I want to be very careful to make sure that I'm not talking about agriculture as a bad thing. I think this is another issue where a lot of folks don't necessarily understand agriculture and its relation to the environment. A lot of environmentalists, I think, have sort of a knee-jerk reaction that agriculture is bad, we have to fix it, it's causing problems. But of course, agriculture is pretty important. Most of us like to eat food. So we need agriculture to grow our food. And with a growing population, it just gets all the more crucial that we have safe and sustainable agriculture practices. So no, agriculture is not bad. There are things we can do better. It does have an impact, like all human activities. It has an impact on our land. And it uses a lot of land. It's especially here in Southwest Michigan, it's a big part of our region. In fact, the next page, I have a map here. So this is a little aerial photograph from an area not too far. It's sort of halfway in between where I am and where you are right now, kind of along the border of Van Buren County and Berrien County. And if you look at that, you can see the sort of a lot of square plots of land, a lot of bare soil. Those are agricultural fields. You can even see like there's some rows here, some planting rows. This might be an orchard down here. There's a little bit of forested area. There's some here and here and here, and some housing, a few roads. But it looks, if I were just to look at this aerial photograph, just a quick screenshot of our area, about 60 to 70%, it looks like, is probably agricultural fields. So that's a big part of our land. And my first degree was in biology, and I was really interested in trees and butterflies and birds and things like that. And kind of had to get dragged into working on agriculture. It wasn't, I didn't have a background in it. I didn't necessarily understand it. But then a friend of mine pointed out to me that that's what our land is, especially, here where we are in Southwest Michigan. So much of our land is agriculture, that if you want to have a positive impact on the environment, that's where we need to work. We need to work with farmers and understand their needs, and try to see what we can do to mitigate the impact of agriculture on our environment. Where this is the world we live in, this is what our environment looks like here. And so this is where we can do some good work. And remember, it all comes back to this idea of what happens on the land affects the water. So the practices that you're seeing on the land will end up impacting the rivers in our area, the streams, the lakes, the Great Lakes eventually. So of course, like I said, agriculture does have an impact on our land. And so here are some of the issues that we have with agriculture. Pardon me, I need a sip of water. So a lot of the work I do focuses on runoff from farm fields. There are other issues of pollution in agriculture, but this is where my work really focuses. So if you think again of that watershed model, and you think of rain falling in a watershed, and that raindrop, everything it touches, it can pick up, a piece of soil or a drop of motor oil and run off towards the nearest stream or river. So on a farm field, the types of pollution that you could have coming off the farm field are sediment, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Nutrients, so to grow crops, we put fertilizers on farm fields, but if the timing is off, if you apply fertilizer right before a rainstorm, that rain might potentially wash that fertilizer off the field and into a nearby creek. Pesticides, so we need certain pesticides to kill insects that might be eating crops. But again, if you don't put on the right kind, or you don't put it on at the right time, it may wash off into the nearest water body. And then manure, a lot of farmers use manure as a fertilizer, which is great. It's recycling in action. But that manure, again, if it's not, the right amount isn't put on, or it's put on at the wrong time, it can wash off into our nearest water body and carry things like bacteria, like E. coli is probably one you've heard of. If you eat a piece of fruit that is contaminated with E. coli bacteria, you can get very sick. A lot of vomiting and other things. So we don't want excess E. coli in our waterways. It's actually a pretty common issue for beaches to be closed at Lake Michigan when there is too much E. coli in the water. The state and county do water testing at swimming beaches, and every now and then there'll be a beach closure because of too much E. coli. So those are the sorts of pollutants that we're talking about when we talk about runoff from farm fields that can affect our water quality. And I mentioned sediment briefly. So sediment we think of as soil or dirt, and that's natural, right? And so a lot of people don't think of that as a pollutant necessarily, but it's actually the #1 pollutant of our waterways in Southwest Michigan. That's not the case everywhere. You know, some places have bigger issues with heavy metals like arsenic or things like that. But in our rivers and lakes in Michigan, this is kind of our #1 thing. So too much sediment in the water, it destroys stream habitat for fish. So if you picture a clear stream with a nice rocky bottom, but then imagine a whole bunch of erosion running off into that water, and it suddenly gets very cloudy. All that nice pebbly bottom of that creek gets covered with sediment, with soil. There are some fish that are pretty picky about where they lay their eggs, and they really much prefer that nice clear stream with a rocky bottom. And now it doesn't have a rocky bottom anymore because it's covered with sediment. And so too much sediment in the water can destroy habitat for fish and also the insects that fish eat, those invertebrates that live in the water. Also, that cloudy water reduces photosynthesis of any plants that might live in the water and reduces oxygen content. And again, oxygen content in the water is important for fish and invertebrates. And also sediment can carry other pollutants. There are other pollutants that bind to sediment. They stick onto them through a chemical process. So things like nutrients from fertilizers or heavy metals like arsenic and bacteria even can kind of stick onto sediment particles. So when you think of a little piece of sand rolling down a hill towards the nearest creek during a rainstorm, it's rolling, and as it's rolling, it can be sticking on to other types of pollution. So just the mere fact of sediment running off into our waterways can carry other pollutants with it. And so in these pictures here, these were taken in Southwest Michigan. So you can see this is a farm field. This is my colleague, Colleen. She's standing at a little erosion gully in a farm field. And it must have been just kind of a steep slope here, and the soil wasn't very well protected. And a heavy rainstorm just washed a gully right through both of these fields, it looks like, and took all of that soil into the nearest creek, basically. And so that's what we're trying to prevent with a lot of our work. And here's an example too. You can see, you know, this is a wet day. It must have been a rainy day, and you can see the water here is coffee colored, and that's running down to a common low spot, a common roadside ditch, which leads to another creek, which leads to the river, which leads to Lake Michigan eventually. So you can imagine that this water carrying all of this soil into the river. So the other problem, besides it carrying pollutants into the waterway, is that this farmer is losing topsoil. You know, when we talked about that with the Dust Bowl, those first top couple inches of soil are where most of the soil activity happens for growing crops. And so as you're losing that, you're losing good quality farm soil. So what we are doing when we talk about conservation practices on farms, we sort of have a few different goals, and we try to make anything we do, we try to meet all of these goals. We want to improve soil quality. So we want to make sure that the soil on these farms stays high quality, and the farmers are able to grow productive crops. Oh, I don't know what happened. It switched on me too fast. Didn't like that slide, I guess. So, well, anyway, while it's thinking about it, there we go. We want to improve soil quality. We want to reduce erosion and water runoff from the farm fields, which will then lead to protected water quality. And we want to keep our sustainable, productive farms. We want to help farmers, you know, stay in business and be able to grow the crops that they want to grow. So the way we achieve those goals, we work with farmers to provide funding to help them put in conservation practices. You know, some of these practices can cost money, or it can just be kind of hard for them to work into their their business plan. You know, farmers are business people, and if they don't have, you know, if they have a whole system set up of how they do their work, and then we walk in and tell them to try something different, it can be a hardship for them. They might not have the funding that they need to do it. So we can provide, we call it cost share. We don't pay for everything, but we pay for a portion of conservation practices to help them kind of get over that hurdle of trying something new. We also provide education, just talking to folks and showing them the pros and cons of different practices and what might work on their field. And then we provide direct assistance. We go out to farm fields and talk to farmers, at least in pre-COVID times, we did a lot more of this, but have just a lot of meetings, a lot of field visits where we go and we look at their farm fields and give them suggestions. So just being a resource for farmers is pretty important to the work we do. So I do want to talk about a few of the practices that we really promote, and this is where most of the work we do focuses. And I'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail, but these are kind of the big four: filter strips, no-till, cover crops, and drainage water management. And before I get too detailed into each of those, I'm going to take a little detour into soils, because this is another thing. As an environmentalist, you know, as a biology major in college, I didn't think I would ever about soil. This was not something I ever spent any time pondering. But as I've learned more and more over the years and started doing more and more work with agriculture, I mean, soils are so important and so linked to both our food system. We have to have healthy, high quality soils to grow enough food for the world. But also it's related really closely to water quality, and healthy soils lead to improved water quality. Because if you can kind of think of a soil like a sponge. And so if you have a sponge, it can hold water. You know, a healthy soil with a lot of roots in it and a lot of biological activity, a lot of insects and worms and bacteria and fungi all work together to make that soil like a really good sponge that holds a lot of water. So it filters water, it stores water, it captures carbon and stores carbon, which is important with climate change. There's a lot of biology that happens in the soil, interactions between fungi and bacteria and the roots of plants, and all of that that activity can help create healthier soils. And with all of these things happening in a healthy soil, you can have much higher productivity on your farm fields. You can, you know, grow more corn or more soybeans or more other kinds of products that end up going into our food system. So here on the left here is just sort of a little infographic about how important soil is and what it's made up of. And just, you know, there's a lot going on. Soil isn't just dirt. There are soil particles, there's minerals, there's water, there's air. There's quite a bit of air. 25% of soil is actually air. And then there's organic matter, leaves, and you know, breaking down little bits of plants. And that's a really important component to a healthy soil, is to have that mix of things. On the right here are some of the things that we really try to talk about with farmers when we are talking about how to keep their soil healthy. We want to keep soil covered with some kind of plant material as much of the year as possible. And that helps prevent erosion and runoff. We want to minimize soil disturbance. So, you know, tilling farm fields is a common practice. I think when you think of a farm, you often think of a tractor tilling up the soil. But we have actually found that not tilling is better for the soil. The soil is an environment. There's an ecosystem there. And when you till it, it can kind of tear up that environment. And over time can actually decrease your soil health. We talk about increasing crop diversity. If you think about ecosystems, in the world, you know, a forest ecosystem, the more diverse it is, the more plants and animals, usually the healthier it is, right? And so as much as we can mimic that in a farm field and increase the diversity, maybe we don't plant the same crop over and over. We rotate crops on the farm field. We plant a variety of things in one spot, perhaps. Keeping that diversity is really important for soil health. Keeping living roots in the soil. Again, think of it like an ecosystem. What's under your feet on the ground, there's an ecosystem there, and keeping living roots in that soil helps filter water through the soil, and it feeds the bacteria and fungi that are living in the soil and keeps it healthy. And then integrating livestock. If farmers can figure out ways to have livestock on their fields, there can be sort of a natural fertilization process. So those, again, those are some of the things we talk about with the practices we recommend to farmers. And so as I go through these practices, you can kind of see these soil health principles at play. So the first one I'll talk about is filter strips, or sometimes they're called buffer strips. And what these are planted areas along a stream or a creek. So you can see here, there's a small little creek running here. There's a farm field over here and another farm field over here. But on the edges of this creek, there's a grassy area. So this is a filter strip. If there's runoff coming off of this farm field, it kind of, you can see there's sort of a slope this way. So if you picture a water drop running off during a rainstorm, that can actually get trapped and stuck in this filter strip. And so any pollution or erosion doesn't actually make it into the creek. It gets trapped in this filter strip. And filter strips can be really effective at trapping sediment and nutrients from running off into our creeks. And so as much as possible, we like to see farm fields not be planted right up to the edge of the creek. We like there to be a bit of an area of natural vegetation that doesn't get tilled up or plowed or anything like that ever. And this one on this side, this is an example of what a farmer that we worked with. The field is, or pardon me, the stream is running right here. He has a farm field here, and then there's another one over here. But this whole area is a permanent buffer strip that he won't ever till up or plow. He mows it every so often just to keep trees and things, shrubs from starting to grow. He wants it to be grassy. So he actually uses this to drive around his farm fields. But that's what this is right here, is that buffer strip. So that's one thing we really like to see on our farm fields in this area. Another thing, it's called no-till. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people think of a farmer or farm fields, and they think of tilling up the soil so you can plant a crop. But as I mentioned, that soil is an ecosystem, and every time you till it, you can disturb that ecosystem. So as much as possible, we encourage farmers not to till their fields. And this is a slightly different practice. You may need different equipment to make it work. But what it does is it leaves plant material decaying on the surface of the soil, which adds nutrients to the soil and also protects it from erosion. So on the left-hand side, this is soybeans, is the plant. And it looks like it was planted into what used to be a cornfield. These brown stalks are corn stubble, we call it. And so last year, that was a cornfield. The farmer harvested the corn, then planted the soybeans using a special planter into the corn. But now in between these soybean rows, there isn't bare soil. So a raindrop falling on this loses some of its energy. So I think when I think about a big rainstorm, and I think about those big, fat, heavy raindrops landing on a farm field, if they land on plant material or corn stubble, and that they have a few minutes to soak into the ground, and all of that energy that is pounding the ground in the raindrops is not leading to erosion and running that soil running off into the nearest lake or stream. And you can see on the right-hand side a similar case, except this is corn now growing, but you can see there's last year's plant material is all protecting the soil in between the corn rows. So there's going to be a lot less issue of runoff and erosion but also this material over time will break down and will add nutrients and organic material to that soil. Another practice is cover crops. So a cover crop is a crop that's planted when your normal crop isn't growing. So say you're a farmer that grows corn. What you'll do, you'll harvest your corn in the fall, sometimes September, October generally, and then you would plant a crop in that same field that would grow over the winter, or would at least start to establish in the fall and keep something in that field over the winter, so the field doesn't stay bare all winter long. And so on the left-hand side, this was a cornfield that got harvested, and then some kind of grass, probably a ryegrass or something, was planted in it. And this grass will have roots that go deep into the soil and help rainwater soak into the field. The soil is protected. There isn't bare soil to run off over the winter. And one of the things with climate change that we're seeing is a lot of our big storms are coming in the fall and winter when there are not many plants growing, and so there is a lot of potential for increased runoff happening in the winter when our farm fields may be bare. And so planting cover crops on them helps really protect them. And on the right-hand side, these are 4 different species of plants that are used in a cover crop field. And we talked earlier about diversity and having as many different plants in a field as possible. And this is a great example of this farmer using 4 different species that all do different things. Some of these have long, deep roots. Some of them have big, short roots that can help break up compaction in the soil. That could be a big issue in our area. A farm field that gets a lot of equipment driven over it can kind of squish down, and a healthy soil is going to be kind of light and fluffy and have lots of room for air and water and roots and earthworms and things like that. But if that soil gets squished down, again, think of it like a sponge getting smushed, and there's less capacity to hold water and air and organic material. But if you put in a nice diversity of cover crops, when you're not growing the crop you're making money on, those cover crops can do some of that work for you in helping heal your soil and adding in organic material and water and things like that. And so we really encourage a lot of farmers in our area to do cover crops. And what we were able to put like 60% of farm fields in one of the areas we work in into cover crops. In the state of Michigan, only about 5 or 6% of agricultural fields generally have cover crops on them in the winter. And so we're really trying to increase that number to help protect our water quality. And those cover crops also help hold nutrients on the farm field. So between improving soil quality, holding nutrients in the farm field, it can have a really positive impact for the farmer. And the last thing I want to talk about for conservation practices that we work on a lot in our area is agricultural drainage. And this was another thing that was new to me when I started working with agriculture and water quality. So in Michigan, we have a lot of wetlands and a lot of wet areas. So this top little block here is kind of a little diagram of what a lot of farm fields look like, because we have a lot of wet areas. And so they might have ponded areas where they wouldn't necessarily work very well for growing crops. So in the late 1800s in Michigan, when people were really trying to figure out how to have more agriculture in Michigan, they realized that they could actually put pipes underneath the farm fields and lower the water table with drainage. And these are sometimes called drain tiles. They used to be made out of clay, and now they're made out of plastic. And here's a picture of what one looks like. So these are actually, and they're not everywhere, but there are quite a few farm fields in Southwest Michigan that have this subsurface drainage to help make areas better for farming. But that can have an impact on our water quality, because this just sort of, if there's any pollutants in that farm field, any nutrients or any extra things like that, it can run off just directly into a creek. And that's what's happening in this picture, is that water is dumping out into a creek. And so there are things that we can do to help mitigate that. You know, we still need to grow crops, and we still need to have areas that work for growing crops. But what we can do is we can actually control that drainage. So it's called drainage water management. So on the left-hand side, this is sort of what's happening in a regular farm field. They might have this drain tile, this pipe underneath their cornfield that's draining water into the nearest creek. But if we want to manage that a little more carefully, you can put in, this is called the water control structure. And what it is it's almost like a little dam on this pipe here. There are these boards inside this structure that block the water from flowing into the creek. And so during a dry summer, if you don't have much rainwater coming, you can actually kind of back up this water and raise the water table in your field. So your crop, in this case, the corn, actually has more access to water. Or in the winter, when you aren't trying to raise a crop in your field, you can raise water and have less water run off into the nearest creek. So it's a way that you can have benefits for both the farmer, because they can keep water in their fields when they need it during drought times and like in a hot summer months of July and August. But also we can protect water quality by damming up that water when the farmer isn't trying to grow a crop in the winter and early spring. And here's an example. We have installed a couple of these structures in the Hartford area, and are doing some research on how well they work and what they do for water quality. So this on the left is a picture of one getting installed. So this is the pipe that's coming from the farm field. It runs right into this structure. This is the top of one of the boards that's inside that works like a little dam. And then this is the pipe that comes out the other side and dumps water into a creek right here. And on the right-hand side, these are some of my colleagues. This is where we had just put this structure in, and we were trying to figure out how to take water samples from it and figure out how to do some research. And then this is an example of the benefit for the farmer. So this is our intern went out. She was taking water quality samples, and we have a farm field where on one side, oh, my screen just froze. Well, I'll talk through it. Oh, let's see. So this, the picture of my intern I'm going to show you. On one side, we have it set up like this, where it's just conventional drainage, and this tile line is just always flowing water out into the nearby stream. And on the other side, we have controlled drainage, where we have one of these structures in place. And so this is the conventional side. So she's my short little intern is about 5 feet tall. And you can see in this picture, the corn is just barely over her head. In this picture, the corn is, 1 to 2 feet over her head. So the corn on this side, where we are actually doing this controlled tile drainage or water management, the corn is actually getting more water and is bigger and healthier. And so it's just a really stark comparison. This is actually the same farm field. The soil is the same. Everything is the same. We just split it down the middle, and one half we managed the drainage water and one half we didn't. And so just in 1 year, we were able to see like, oh, there's a benefit for the farmer. The farmer was pretty happy about this, being able to kind of control his water a little bit better. And so just to end, I want to just impress upon you that try to look at farming with a fresh perspective. I know, like I said, when I got into this work, farming and agriculture was not what excited me. I was more excited about trees and butterflies, but it's such an important part of our community and of our world. We have to grow food for the world, but we can think of ways that we can have farming that's sustainable and good for our world and doesn't cause a negative impact. But think about where your food comes from and what practices the farmers that grow it might be using. And yeah, just try to advocate for sustainable farming, sustainable practices. And when you drive down a country road, look at the farm fields and see, do they have, you know, plant stubble on their fields in the winter? Is there a cover crop growing in November or things like that? You don't ever want to see bare soil on a farm field in the winter. And these conservation practices can protect us from looking at, or from seeing another dust bowl in the future, or having algae blooms in our lakes and rivers, and other threats to our environment. So there's a way that we can do this. We can have productive agriculture that's sustainable, that protects our water quality. And just one last quick slide. This is like my 15 minutes of fame. My name was in National Geographic magazine last month. So I can't stop talking about that, but it is, you know, I'm a little biased because my name's in there. See, that's my name right there. But the story is about saving the Great Lakes. And this whole section here is the writer interviewed a local farmer talking about his struggles with agriculture. There have been a lot of issues with climate change. Our climate is changing and storms are coming at different times of year, and farmers are having to adapt to those changes. And a lot of these conservation practices can help them overcome some of the obstacles that they've had. And there's a big part of this article that's about agriculture and the environment and our Great Lakes. So it actually, I'm not just plugging myself. This actually does tie into this topic. And I thought it was a nice, well-rounded article. And it talks about a lot of threats. And I saw the list of topics that you folks have heard in this series. And I think this article actually touches on quite a few of them. So it's a good one. So with that, any comments or questions?
Okay, thank you very much, first of all. Anybody has questions? One question is, can you send me the link or what, more information, the reference for this article, Saving the Great Lakes?
Sure. Yep.
The page. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was December 2020 issue. So it just came out.
Oh, it's recent.
Last month. Yeah. Yep. Just
okay.
happened. And yeah, it's the cover article. I know my name is on page 75, but okay. I know that much. The article is longer than that.
Okay. All right. So you're recently famous.
Yes, that's why I'm still putting it in my PowerPoints, because it's still pretty exciting.
Okay, very good, very good. So any questions you guys have? We are good. All right. Well, thank you so very much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks everybody for listening, and I hope nobody went to sleep, but please be in touch if you have any questions.
We will encourage them to connect up with you, and this will be posted on YouTube later on today.
Very good. Thanks everybody.
All right.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a great day.